Good afternoon, St. Louis, and welcome in to Cards Hub 365 on Sports Hub STL. I'm your host for today, Matthew Rocchio, joined by Brenden Schaeffer, and we're here to talk about some Cardinals baseball as they did fall 6-5 in spring training. Who cares about the actual score? We're here to get into the nitty-gritty and some news. Before we do that, though, Brenden Schaeffer, how you doing today, sir?
Oh, I'm doing very well, and we can all uncross our fingers. The voodoo magic we did for Jordan Walker's knee apparently worked to some extent, because overnight we weren't really sure the extent of what that injury was going to be, Rock, but seemingly the Cardinals, I think we escaped the worst case scenario with this one.
Yeah, it looks like it. Let's actually jump to that. John Denton reporting on Twitter alongside everyone else as well. I just grabbed Denton's because I love Big John. St. Louis Cardinals right fielder Jordan Walker has no structural damage in his left knee and will be shut down for a week to try and let the inflammation above the knee calm down, per manager Ali Marmol. Walker had an MRI on Tuesday night after jamming his knee upon stepping on a sprinkler head. So far, it's not Vince Coleman all over again. The deja vu, the sky is falling, the what have you, the freak out among St. Louis can calm down. We're going to leave that tweet up on the screen, and everyone just can kind of sit back and take a nice deep breath before we talk about the other thing we're going to freak out about, which is right above my head right now. We'll talk about that later. Let's focus on the good news for Jordan Walker, Brenden.
Yeah, I mean, this is good. Look, and still he's going to be shut down for a week to see if that inflammation calms down. But Oliver Marmol said, like, this was good news, because when a freak accident happens like that, we always refer to it as the non-contact injury. When it comes to a knee, that, like, there are a lot of things it could have been that are much worse than what it was. So ideally, this is just something that Jordan Walker is off his feet for a week or so and can begin ramping back up. We'll see whether or not it impacts his readiness for the start of the season. Hopefully, it happened early enough in the month of March. The opening day at Busch is March 27th. That maybe this shouldn't have any impact on his readiness for the roster. But I think, at least according to everything that's been said about this so far, the Cardinals avoided the worst case scenario on this one. And how frustrating would that have been? You go into a year where Jordan Walker is one of the handful of names that you're like, this is somebody that has to take a step forward. We've got to give this guy the runway, the playing time, the opportunity. And if that would have been the way that his season would have gone off the rails, and it doesn't seem like it was, would have been brutal. But like I said, I think we can all kind of breathe that sigh of relief right now.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Jeff Castle, by the way, joins us here on YouTube, and you can join the YouTube chat as well. He says, good afternoon, gentlemen, with a little baseball emoji. And you can join the chat as well here on YouTube. Questions, comments, there wasn't a ton to take. We're obviously going to talk about Sonny Gray getting beat up a little bit, but, it is spring training. So if you have any other bigger questions for Brenden Schaeffer and myself while we're here live today on Cards Hub 365, drop them in the chat right now, and we make sure we get to them. So, yeah, obviously, best case scenario for Walker. There has been a lot of conversations around the outfield right now. Update me, briefly. Where do you stand right now on the Ciani and VS2 battle for center field? And were you fine with the idea of just getting him innings in left field last week?
Yeah, I think that's just getting him some playing time. They want to give Lars Nootbaar a look in center field as well, because if it comes to it in the regular season that they feel the need to align their lineup that way, at least he's got some familiarity with the spot. My position is that Victor Scott can take the center field job if he continues to perform the rest of spring the way that he has in a very limited sample so far, because he's sort of the best of both worlds. Like, the reason that you would put Lars Nootbaar in center field would be if you were trying to maximize as many of the bats in the lineup that you possibly could. Cardinals ranked 22nd in runs scored last year across MLB, and it's been a common drumbeat from anybody you talk to. They know they've got to score more runs this year if they're going to get closer to a playoff spot. So putting Newt in center, maybe that allows you to move Donovan to left, Gorman to second, and Burleson fits in that DH spot. But another way to potentially maximize the lineup offensively is if Victor Scott can be that force offensively, and he's basically maybe not quite as good at this stage defensively as Michael Ciani, but the raw abilities are certainly there. And we think with more opportunity to grow, he can turn into that elite caliber Gold Glove type defender. So I think that could end up being the best of both worlds. It's the best case scenario, but the degree to which Victor Scott actually grabs hold of that job is going to be up for the determination of the coaching staff over the next few weeks.
All right, before we dive into some of the news from today's game, B.O. jumps into the chat. Gorman seems to be seeing the ball much better the last few games, and he's cut out the strikeouts. Any thoughts? Also, what are the chances to JC and Weatherholt have a chance to play this year? I assume, obviously, that means in the majors.
Yeah, so when it comes to Gorman, the at-bats have looked a little bit better. He was off to that wretched start, and you try not to overreact to the first week of action. Let's get more of a sample size before we really go either direction, right? Say, oh, he stinks, he can't make contact. And then let's not take a couple of games where he's swinging it a little bit better and then says, okay, he's fixed. Like, I think that sample is going to add up, but certainly Gorman's going to get every opportunity. I think the threshold for what he was supposed to show in spring to be granted that runway was really, really low. And he's starting to come around. So I feel like he's still going to be in that opening day lineup. There's not really a lot of question in my mind about that, at least from a health perspective. Let's talk about Sajacy, though, and Weatherholt was part of that question from B.O. Mm-hmm. Weatherholt, I would be very, 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 very surprised if you see in St. Louis at any point in 2025. Yeah. I think he starts between either Peoria and Double-A Springfield. Either one would be understandable. If it's Peoria, I think it's a quick cup of coffee down there. And if he performs, he kind of passes the test. You move him up to Double-A, where he ostensibly spends a good chunk of the summer. Now, if he's just going gangbusters in Double-A, they wouldn't probably wait too long to promote him to Triple-A. But I don't think you're going to necessarily see a quick jaunt to Double-A, and then they're going to call him straight up from there. That would surprise me. That would take some real Herculean performance from Weatherholt. And even still, doesn't make sense for the Cardinals to do that, because a lot of times we talk, Rock, about service time manipulation, and more often than not, I don't think teams really do it. I don't think the Cardinals really do it, but not necessarily for the reason that you're thinking. They haven't really had players that it's worth doing it to. Like, even prospects like a Jordan Walker, like those guys have come up and then they've gone back down. So really the whole point of a service time manipulation is you have a guy that you know that once he's up to stay, and you try to get that extra year out of him before going to free agency. So in the case of Weatherholt, like, maybe he could end up being that caliber of a player. All the more reason not to rush him. I think 2026, it's so in play going to spring training for JJ Weatherholt to make this team if he progresses in 2025 the way you want to see. But I don't necessarily think it's going to happen that he debuts this year unless he just absolutely wows you passing each step of the way. And in the case of Sajacy, he'll be on the team at some point in 2025. I don't think it will be to start the campaign unless you have an injury or two across that infield that would allow him to play every single day. Otherwise, you're talking about an infielder for a bench spot that comes from that class of Michael Hellman, maybe Jose Barrero, guys that can play a little bit of outfield as well, so they've got that versatility. Throw Jose Fermin into that conversation too. Those are guys that, it's going to sound a little bit crass. You can let them rot on the bench for the most part, and you're going, it's fine. They're not really top prospects. You're not going to do that with a Thomas Sajacy. That's a name that you want to see play pretty much every single day. So I would expect Sajacy to begin the year in AAA unless the Cardinals staff believes they've got 4 starts a week for him at the major league level.
Two things. One thing I do want to say, to your point about the Cardinals not really manipulating service time, and when they were bringing up guys, they weren't really worried about getting an extra year or two out of them because they were giving them the extensions.
Right.
They were giving the extensions before they would actually even hit that conversation. Now, those extensions didn't work out for the most part, but they weren't even trying to manipulate because they were like, you know what? We'll give him 5 years and $55 million because it locks him in and he's happy, he gets a little money. So it works in a lot of ways. And actually, you led into a perfect comment here from Redbird Farmhands there with Barrero's home run, which he hit late in the game to actually take a 5-3 lead. Prieto was on base, so a 2-run shot for Barrero. Do you think he's the leading candidate for that backup infield job that you were just kind of referring to?
I don't know if he's the leading candidate, and it's really difficult to kind of look at a small sample of string numbers and say that there is an obvious leading candidate, but I think he gets more consideration than I would have told you prior to Grapefruit League games beginning. The part that would have been the downside for Barrero is that he's not currently on the 40-man roster, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about that he was a minor league invite to spring camp, but he does have shortstop experience, more of kind of a glove-first guy historically, and we'll see what it looks like defensively the more he plays short. but I believe it's his second home run of the spring. So he's starting to swing it pretty well and will continue to get opportunities. He's in that class of players that's going to play a ton, I think, over the course of Grapefruit League as we continue on in the weeks to come, because they do want to get an idea and get eyes on him. He's a guy that has former prospect capital, but then the flame kind of went out on him with other organizations. But if he can be that guy that can basically spell Mason win every other week and then can play a couple of different positions for you off the bench, I think that's really all the Cardinals are looking for from that spot. And so far, we haven't really seen Hellman or Fermin really pop. So other than the fact that he doesn't have a roster spot, which forces the Cardinals to go, do we DFA somebody to make the upgrade from Hellman to Barrero on our bench? Sometimes everybody would say, oh, the best players need to be on the team. Sometimes the best players aren't on the team because the team doesn't want to make a roster move that ends up being permanent, right? If you DFA somebody and he gets claimed, that's permanent. Now, at times you go, well, Fermin's been around a while, and if he hasn't shown it by now, maybe that's the move you make. And with Hellman, it's easy come, easy go. Maybe that is the way that some people view it. I don't know if the Cardinals would view it that way. So Barrero is definitely off to a hot start, but the burden is almost on him to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's the best choice, because there is a roster move that would be associated with including him.
Bayo says, thanks, guys, and thank you very much for the super chat there, Bayo.
Before
we hit Brian's question, and I like the question, I just want to update everyone on that little conversation we just had there. Ostensible backups that are on the 40-man roster right now, not including guys who are in 50-50 inning share situations like catcher. Luken Baker, Jose Fermin, Thomas Saggese, Michael Hellman, Matt Koperniak. Those are the 5 guys right now on the 40, according to MLB.com, that are in kind of deep utility or deeper backup roles and not fighting for a job right now.
Yeah, and I mean, each of them can kind of serve their own role if they make that bench. Luken Baker would be the pop from the right side off the bench, and he's got 3 homers now. I hope to God this guy makes the team.
Yeah, it would be awesome. I would love that.
Like, legitimately fits the roster so well, and I know he doesn't play a position, and he's going to be more of a DH, but you like a threat off the bench. Like, I think you'll have enough defensive versatility with Brendan Donovan that can play just about everywhere when he's in your lineup. That key cog means that you can be a little bit more lenient with your bench in terms of the versatility. And I still think they're going to roster a Hellman or a Fermin or a Barrero, and so that's going to be that guy that can play just about everywhere, to where if you found yourself short on one given day because of an injury and guy has to play out of position for a couple of innings, you make a roster move the next day with the injured list, and it's no longer a problem. I think you can be aggressive and say Luken Baker can take an at-bat with some of the lefties that, maybe not priorities to face left-handed relievers late in games. Luken can take a number of those at-bats, and I think he can be productive for you. And look, like, I'm not even counting him out that he could be a future MLB starter at first base. It's probably a long shot, but when the guy just hits everywhere he goes, maybe give him a chance at that highest level and see if he can adapt to a bench role. Rocchio, you followed NFL, you follow MLB. Sometimes there are guys who are talented, but for various reasons, whether it's contracts, draft capital, whatever the case, they don't get as much opportunity to prove what they're capable of, but they grind and they earn everything that they end up getting. Luken Baker, for better or worse, seems like he's going to have to be one of those types of guys, but if he continues to produce, I think he should be on this bench. You'll have a backup catcher. You'll have an infielder that isn't Thomas Saggese, unless you think you can start him more often than I see fit for right now with a fully healthy team. And then you probably have that utility person. And then the other conversation that makes it a little bit tricky, Rock, is the Victor Scott thing. If he ends up being the center fielder, Ciani, I still think, has value off your bench, and you might be straining a little bit to find an infielder that has the defensive versatility at that point. Like, fitting the Hellman spot on your bench could be more of a challenge along with Luken Baker. I value the Luken Baker thing. I really believe that he can help the Cardinals on a day-to-day basis if they just let him be a bench bat that takes those tough ABs against lefties late in games.
And with the way the offense was last year, having guys who can just give you strong at-bats and moments when you need them with runners in scoring position, I like the idea of this being like a very just kind of like segmented team for different things. Like you mentioned Michael Ciani, if he's a backup, well, yeah, put Michael Ciani in the starting lineup when like Miles Michaelis gets starts, because you want to completely just plus out your defense because
Exactly.
you know that there's going to be contact with the way that Miles Michaelis pounds the strike zone and those kind of things. Brian, I'm going to get to your chat, but we're talking about some of the younger players, and Justin Hutchins always in the chat on the morning show with Brooke and Randy, so I know he likes the young players. I wanted to see if we had any thoughts on this chat here. Will Chandler Redmond be back in Springfield this year or be in Memphis? Any thoughts on that, Brenden?
I don't actually have thoughts on that because Chandler Redmond, when you talk about young player, is actually not. He's 28 years old now and finally got the bump up to Memphis at the end of last season. I would say as long as he's still in the organization, because you get to a certain age and the Cardinals might just there's a possibility of them cutting him if he's not, somebody that they're looking forward to in the big leagues, which I think he's another guy that has produced, but they've been very slow to call him up. When you have someone in your organization like Luken Baker that has led all of the minor leagues in home runs over the past 3 seasons, it's like, that's a nice accomplishment. It also means he's been at the minor leagues for a long time. So you hate to be the guy that's behind him on the organizational depth chart, and that's been Chandler Redmond. And so if Baker's in St. Louis, Redmond can fit in Memphis, and I think that can work out just fine. But we'll see. I don't know that he's somebody that the Cardinals view to have a major league future, but time will tell.
All right, let's go to Brian. What do you guys think of dealing Helsley? Didn't seem like the Birds really even explored it. And in a rebuild, couldn't it be said that he would be the chip that could bring back the biggest return?
If they were in a rebuild, that would be the case, right? But they're not. They're not in a rebuild, Brian. That's the way that they describe it. It's not a rebuild situation, right? It's a reset, retool, and then they've moved on. We're calling it a transition year is kind of the way that they prefer to discuss it at this point. And what does it mean? It means when you're having a transition year, you start with maybe some players that you don't end the season with. And that can look like Miles Michaelis. That can look like Steven Matz. And I'm not saying those guys, if they perform well, are going to just be cut June 1st, but they're not under contract for next year. So as the season goes along, you look for spots to potentially make moves. In the case of Helsley, it's if he performs really well and the Cardinals are 8 games below 500, well, you're probably trading a guy like that at the deadline when hopefully his value is at the highest. But no, Keith, it's not a rebuild, at least in the way the Cardinals are approaching it. Look, we can look at it from the outside and say, oh, they stink. It's a rebuild. No, they're not. If it was a rebuild, Rocchio, Miles Michaelis wouldn't be on this team day one. Matz would not be on this team day one. They would have traded Fetty.
Eric Fetty would not be on this team if it was a rebuild.
And it's not a rebuild.
It's such a tradable contract. I think that, I mean, you need Matz to show like 4 innings that his arm won't fall off, and all of a sudden his contract is tradable in July. When there's a team that's just like, yeah, we just need an arm who costs us like less than $15 million. There's not a lot of those in baseball right now that show they can be, sub 4 ERA, even out of the bullpen, and that's a useful thing. I've been saying that about Matz for a year and a half almost. And so, there's a lot of guys they could probably have shipped off for any piece of capital they could have got their hands on, and they didn't. Let's go.
They haven't yet. They haven't yet, right? The trade deadline exists. Could there be a world in which teams are more desperate to acquire a Fetty or a Helsley? Like, you look at the offseason trade market for relief pitchers. It wasn't robust. Devin Williams got traded. What did he get dealt for? A middling prospect, decent prospect, and a starting pitcher, Nestor Cortez, with 1 year on his deal. So the Cardinals weren't trying to pick up more one-year guys. They have a few of those, and you would have wanted prospects for them. They don't have the types of moves, like the moves in the market didn't take place that would have made sense to say, let's jump in and capitalize on that with Fetty and with Helsley. Yes, you're holding your breath a little bit that if the Cardinals aren't highly competitive, those two are healthy come July, because then you probably would need to trade them. But maybe you're competitive. And I know you're saying, well, they didn't really try to be competitive with the moves they made this offseason. No, they didn't. I'm not saying it's ideal to be in the middle, but they're in the middle. They're transitioning to a team that hopefully in 26 or 7 can end up back competitive, spending money again. And if they get lucky, they're going to end up closer to that in 2025 than maybe a lot of people think. But I'm not like defending that as the strategy, because there are some questions as to why you would stake your entire year on that when it seemingly is an important year. But I'll give the Cardinals the benefit of the doubt that if you get into mid-May and Michaelis is struggling or Matz is struggling, you just cut him, because you might have guys in AAA that are ready for the roles in the rotation. So I am going to say that I understand a lot of the skepticism that Cardinals fans have about the direction this year. But if 6 weeks go by and they've made some moves that make it feel a little more palatable and like they are transitioning toward a younger group, I'll give them credit. If they don't, I'm going to be talking about, hey, where does the transition come in?
I agree with you there.
I mean,
and also,
the proof is going to be in the pudding, where it's not.
Keith Adams, I get your point, but there's a line here where you're not wrong. I agree with you that they should have rebuilt. If I was John Mozeliak or Chaim Bloom, I would probably have torn things down. That's my perspective. But when we're saying it's not a rebuild, that's because
they didn't.
That's they didn't do it, and that's the reality of the situation in front of us. And that's all we can deal with. And at this point, that seems to be the Cardinals' take on it, which is this isn't a rebuild. And every time they've talked about tearing things down to the studs, they've put up a blocker and been like, we don't go that far here.
Arenado's not even gone. Arenado's still on. He's your third baseman. There was no movement toward rebuild this offseason, which means there's really not much of a move toward reset. But if that stuff happens in the early going, if Michaelis 3 starts in is just getting shelled.
This feels like we're in an NFL city during the draft, and I'm trying to explain the difference between. I understand you're right. If I was running the team, I would do this.
Not what they did.
That's not what's going to happen. So stop. Just get over the fact that that's not what's going to happen. Jeff Fisher's not going to draft a quarterback in the first round.
Sad day. Sorry. Sad. But you know what? The Cardinals, if they get through April and they're 2 games above 500. Their goal of like, hey, let's just be kind of competitive. And really, I can't even call it their goal because like they tried to trade Arenado, which ostensibly would have made them less competitive if he's a good player still. But if they're above 500 by whatever you call it, you might out there call it sheer dumb luck. The Cardinals might say, no, we had a good young core and they elevated and here we are and we're in the mix. Like if that ends up being the way it goes, you'll be a Cardinal fan watching a team in May and June that's a couple games above 500 going, hey, we're only 2 games out of a playoff spot here. And at that point, I think the fans will be glad to have Eric Fedde on the team because he probably makes you better. It gives them what the Fedde, Michaelis, and Matt's contingent does is it gives the Cardinals a month to 6 weeks to be able to see, like, is Graceffo really ready for a rotation spot in the big leagues? Is Quinn Matthews really ready? Is Tekoa Roby on that fast track? Like, gives them a little bit.
We don't even know if Michael McGreevy's ready, do we?
Michael McGreevy, that's another one that. So, like, I think that this could be a much younger rotation when you get a few months into the season. If the guys that are in it don't perform, and if the guys that are in it do perform, the Cardinals are probably better than whatever the public sentiment on this team is, and that is a good thing, I think, for the Cardinals to be better than you thought they were.
Henry Wells, a little positivity. If the Cardinals are contending, do they supplement this team? Everyone is expecting this to fall off. They will shock and be better than a lot of people say and slip into the playoffs. And I know that sounds like a little bit pie in the sky here, but I mean, that mentality was kind of the first reaction that I remember. I think it was maybe just the second or third Cards Hub 365 on Sports Hub STL when you, Claves, and Joe were kind of throwing out the idea of, what if this team is, above 500 and challenging in the Central when things turn to July, and all of a sudden we've gone from the conversation we were just having, 180 seconds ago to, are they buying because they've got a chance to make a run with a healthy Helsley, an Arenado that's producing, and maybe some augmentation from the young players like a Victor Scott or Jordan Walker, so on and so forth.
The burden of proof is maybe going to have to be high because, like, the closer you get to October, the closer you are to Chaim Bloom having full control. And so I feel like at a July deadline before his takeover, he should have a lot of influence on the direction that they go. And if they're 2 games above 500, but the division leader is 10 games above in the wild card, there's some pretty good wild card teams, so you're 7 out or something. You're like, I think that's, even though you've done a nice job, we probably should sell off the short-term assets and get what we can for them. But if you're like in a playoff spot in the month of July, can't really hurt to maybe just kind of see what you have and add potentially small ways, like a bullpen piece. You can always add a bullpen guy in July. I don't think they would add anything that takes away from their future in a substantial way. But I guess I'm saying that without knowing what the hypothetical record would be. And so they won 83 games last year. I don't think they're drastically worse this year on paper. So, like, it's going to be very interesting. If they're smack dab 500, no, I don't think that they add. But if the further above 500 you go by the middle of July, and you have to force those conversations where Mozeliak's going to say, what do I care? Let's add. we could go out on top, in terms of my tenure. Chaim Bloom's going to say, yeah, this is kind of my job for the next however many years. I want to make sure that we're set up.
I was just thinking about that too, of like what if, because every year something happens where a young star kind of gets a little tweaked, and everyone says, we could put together 3 of our young players and combine that for that young move. And it's like, if a move like that kind of starts becoming the talk, does John Mozeliak pull that trigger? And do you have a problem with that as a fan, because you want Chaim Bloom to be making the decisions because he's the one who's going to have the driver's seat? So that there's a lot of things that, if they are good, that are still kind of up in the air, that aren't just, roses and things like that. Before we continue, we're getting a couple more chats here. You are tuned in to Cards Hub 365, presented by powered by Gray Bar, I should say, because they're your distributor for electrical and datacom needs. That's where the powering comes from. Your distributor for electricom and datacom needs. That's Gray Bar. Find them online at graybar.com. This is Cards Hub 365 on Sports Hub 365. Jump into the chat if you got questions, comments. We're going to be going here for about 6-7 more minutes. Brian, still in the chat. How has Wilson Contreras looked at first base? Can he be a league average defensive WAR guy at first base? Honestly, I've really only been paying attention to his bat.
And that's all I care about for the most part until he messes up something like super easy. Who cares? Like it's like the Moneyball quote. How hard can it be? No, I think he's making progress at first base, but it's not going to be Goldschmidt. Just as long as you go in expecting him to sock some dingers and not be Goldschmidt defensively, it's going to be hard to be too disappointed, because look, there'll be some plays that are plays not made, whether they call them errors, whether it's just a near miss. It's going to happen.
He's not going to pick Mason Wynn. He's not going to pick Mason Wynn at the level that Goldie did.
Goldie was a machine at it, man.
People are going to complain so much the first time that Wynn rips one over there, and Contreras, it blitzes, it comes off the tip of his glove, because he's just not gauging how fast it's going to be.
You just got to get over it, because there's no good answer. Like they moved on from Goldschmidt. I think it was understandable given their position, and honestly, you have Contreras as probably the best hitter in this lineup. You look the last 2 seasons, he's had the best numbers offensively on this team. So, finding a way to keep him in there, and maybe having Ivan Herrera have an 800 OPS in your lineup at the same time helps the team. They got to score more runs, and it's just going to have to come with a little bit of risk on the defensive side, I think.
We'll say Ivan Herrera looked good today, went 2 for 2 at the plate, including
he can rake
RBI early in the game, no doubt about that. Redbird Farmhands on the chat here on YouTube. Since Scott and Burley are kind of indirectly competing against each other, who do you think is more likely to be starting on opening day? I mean, at this point, Burley's most likely start on opening day is.
Now walk through this. What's the path to Burleson starting on opening day? I think, let's say without injuries.
Gorman's struggling so much, they put him at DH.
Gorman's struggling so much that he's in AAA to start the year, which I don't think happens. Even with just a couple of recent days where he's looked better, I think Gorman's probably your DH. So what's the path to Burleson, who, when you talk to Ollie Marmol, it's kind of like, yeah, he's working out at first base this year. Like, he's not really as much in that outfield conversation as he was last year. At least is my read on the situation. And Wilson's your first baseman. Yeah. So I would say, for sure, barring injury, Scott has a better chance to start on opening day, because if Scott's on the team, it's because he's starting on opening day. If Scott's not on the team, it's one of 2 things have happened. Like, Ciani held him off for the job and he's starting on opening day, or the Cardinals decide. And I guess this is maybe where Farmhands is an interesting question, because I have been operating from a place of, don't put Nootbaar in center field. Like, don't do that. But John Mozeliak, a week or 2 ago, I believe the article was Ken Rosenthal's, where he was quoted and kind of asking hypothetically about, we don't know if we're going to be good or bad, but if this, and this happens, maybe we're actually pretty decent this year. And one of those ifs was, if Brendan Donovan, can he be an all-star caliber left fielder? And you go, left fielder? The only way that's happening is Nootbaar playing center. So was that my tip, my little hint, that the front office really would like to see what an extended run of Newt in center would look like? And sort of when Ollie Marmol had said early in spring, he said it a couple different times when he's asked about the crux, the defense versus offense conversation, which do you prioritize? He said that's a deeper conversation that has to happen between field staff and the front office, and we have to talk about that over the weeks to come and come to a decision. It's a long-term, not a short-term discussion. And by that, I think you could say, well, if Nootbaar's a center fielder because they want him to be one for the long haul and sign him to an extension as one and all these things, like they have to put him out there this year versus how do you prioritize making sure guys like Burleson and Gorman get their ABs? I guess Farmhands, the question is more simply asked, do you think that this notion of the front office wanting Nootbaar to play center comes to fruition on opening day? And if it does, Burley's got a spot for sure. The other thing is any injury to almost anybody other than the catcher or Mason Wynn prior to opening day, I think puts Burley in a great spot to start. I don't think the same can be said for Victor. I think Victor actually has to go out and win that job in order to start. It's about his production. Burley's situation is more about everybody else's production or health, to be quite honest. Because if like Arenado gets hurt, you can move the puzzle pieces. Gorman to third, Donovan to second. Who's your DH? Or I should say Donovan to left, Gorman is at third. Like you have enough ways to put that Burley suddenly slides into a DH role if Gorman slides into a position of third or second, and any like a corner outfielder getting hurt, Donovan goes out there. So suddenly Gorman's on the field. Burleson's the DH. So it's really tricky to ask, but I guess Scott has to earn it. Burley he can earn it or not, but he also has to have some help. And so I don't know which is more likely as a result, because it's kind of, I wouldn't agree they're competing with each other. It's kind of two separate tracks.
One thing you kind of threw out there, you don't think there's a possibility that Gorman struggles and it leads to him being off the bench early instead of
no chance.
Sent down?
No chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, is facing minor league pitching at this point really going to help Nolan Gorman?
No, but staying on the bench isn't either. I hear your point. I just think if he's going to be on the team, it's to play, and they could send him down if he really struggles. But I think he'll be doing enough that they're like, all right, we said runway. Here's your runway.
All right, fair enough. That's Brenden Schaeffer. I'm Matthew Rocchio. Thank you so much for joining us today for Cards Hub 365, presented by Gray Bar. Brenden Schaeffer, we got to get out of here. We did about 30 minutes here.
Come back tomorrow.
Come back tomorrow. Day. There we go. Every day. We're powered by Gray Bar here, your distributor for electrical and datacom needs. Find them online at graybar.com. Again, tomorrow morning, again on the Randy Carricker show featuring Brooke Grimsley. Sorry, what's the name of that show, Brendan?
It's the Randy is awesome and Brooke is here too show, as I like to call it.
That's true. I'm also in the room at the.
You're kind of there as well, yeah.
And we'll be talking some Cardinals baseball tomorrow, obviously because of the news. We're going to be having Benji Molina on the show about 10:25. So stay tuned to Sports Hub 365. Like and subscribe. Hit the little button there so that you get notified, because whenever there's news here in St. Louis sports, whenever there's an event in St. Louis sports, including, hey, we got events going because we got the Tigers going, we got the Blues going, which means there are more things coming up on Sports Hub STL later today. Again, we'll have Mizzou Hub postgame and Blues Hub postgame coming up later today here on Sports Hub 365. Thank you so much for joining us here on Cards Hub 365, Sports Hub STL and Cards Hub 365. Thank you so much for joining us today. Be safe. You have a great rest of your day, sir.
You too. See you, buddy.
Have a great rest of your day, St. Louis.